America and other countries that make the G7 have had a long and very complicated relationship with Russia. For centuries, the two sides have been intertwined through trade, diplomacy, and warfare. However, in recent years, tensions have been rising as Russia has been becoming increasingly assertive on the world stage. Owing to this and the war in Ukraine, the G7, along with its ally Australia, had imposed a price cap on the export of oil from Russia. So what is the purpose of the price cap that put in place, and what are its impacts? What is Russia's reaction to the whole scenario? We'll be answering this and more along the video, so join us as we reveal today's headlines. One major source of tension between the G7 and Russia is the conflict in Ukraine. This conflict has killed thousands and displaced even more. The European Army and many of its member states have imposed sanctions on Russia in response to these actions, and have provided financial and military aid to Ukraine and its survivors. Both the EU and the West have made several sanctions and prohibition against Russia, which limits a lot of the freedom that it used to have before the attack on Ukraine. These sanctions have definitely made a difference in the state of affairs in Russia. The European Union has also banned almost all seaborne imports from Russia from the 5th of December, and also joined with the group of 7 nations in capping the price at which Moscow can sell barrels. Anyone wanting to hire European ships, including the giant Greek tanker fleet, or access other vital services, can only do so if they pay $60 a barrel or less for the cargoes. Since that date, European-owned tankers have taken about 30% of the cargoes shipped from Russia's key western oil ports. You might be wondering, what are these changes and how has it affected the Russians? The price cap initiative was introduced on the 5th of December, when the EU stopped taking Russian crude oil. The price scheme requires buyers outside of the G7 using Western services, such as maritime routes, insurance, and financing, to pay no more than $60 per barrel for the seaborne Russian crude oil. And from the 5th of February 2023, the EU countries would no longer be able to access seaborne Russian oil products. The Group of Seven's oil price cap scheme, intended to limit Russia's oil export revenues, is working well so far, said Amos Hochstein, who is the special presidential coordinator to the United States President Joe Biden. As oil prices have come down, there's no doubt that the price cap has thus far worked, though it does seem like it has a long way to go, especially since the price cap put on the Russians hasn't had a chance to really take its toll yet, as the oil prices of today circles around $53. But it does seem that the ideal goal in which the price cap was implemented has been achieved, which was to have a continued supply of oil on the market to support economic growth while limiting the value of that oil makes for Putin. President Vladimir Putin has announced during the beginning of the war in January that from the 1st of February Russia would stop the supply of crude oil and its products for the period of 5 months to all nations that will adhere to the price cap implemented by the G7 and its allies. This retaliation to the G7 would be followed by a separate ban linked to refined oil products. Amos Hochstein has also been quoted complimenting on the fact that discount on Russian oils has increased, and how that's a good thing. He also hopes that it continues like it does now. Though Hochstein hadn't really specified on how much the price ceiling initiative by the G7 is costing Russia now, Finland's Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air estimates this toll is 160 million euros, which is roughly about $172 million. When additional measures are implemented, the economic hit is expected to rise to 250 million euros per day, which is around $269 million. The import ban and price cap together have caused almost a 32% drop in Russia's oil revenues in December. When the plan for the price ceiling was first sketched out, it faced a lot of skepticism and reservations from the analysts. The former U.S. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin had called this idea ridiculous and completely impractical to implement, let alone to have such a positive impact. Now, what exactly were the intentions behind this decision by the G7 and its allies? The goals behind the measures that came into existence in early December were actually twofold. Though the purpose of the price ceiling was to reduce the revenue Russia earns from its oil energy exports, the other goal was to make sure that Russian oil keeps flowing into the world markets to avoid the oil prices from rising too much, and then eventually reaching all consumers all over the world at an even higher price. What's evident right now is that there has been a very strong drop in the oil prices that Russia is earning, which is why there was only a very small drop in the Russian export volumes. So given the current situation, it's pretty evident that the initial goal by the G7 and its ally Australia that it had sketched up and implemented as the price ceiling on Russian oil exports is a success. But it's still pretty unclear which measure is exactly causing what sort of effect. On one side, the EU countries that have stopped importing most of the oil from Russia back in early December, instead choosing to stock up on diesel and its other resources. This basically resulted in the Russians having lost a very large market. On the other side, the G7 had also implemented a shipping ban, in which it made clear that none of the American companies that had actually provided the insurance for these tankers would not continue to do so. This makes it extremely hard for Russia to send the oil to other markets, as the high rates charged along with the untrustworthy insurances provided proves to be a very high risk that Russia would soon have to take upon. It is also possible that both these measures taken by the G7 and its ally Australia are the cause of Russia having to sell very cheaply. Though at this point in time, the EU import ban can be seen as the most important measure taken in the series. These measures are making it more difficult for Moscow to fund his war in Ukraine than it would appear. Another important question that arises in between all this commotion is whether the current situation in Russia leads other countries like India and China to ask for an even lowered price import of oil into their countries from Russia. The prices in which the oil from Russia is imported into India and China are determined by the supply and demand. In the current situation, the Russian economy has a lot of oil supply coming into the market, since it can't export to any of the EU countries anymore. This causes a lot of oil that is just held in excess in Russia without that much of a demand as before. India and Chinese refineries can quite actually ask for a lower priced oil from Russia, and it is if they cannot get it from one company, they can just go to another company to complete its needs. Basically, it is still in the power of supply and demand that determine the prices. But it would be a whole different game once the oil price cap starts working properly, with the rise of the price of oil above the price cap decided. At this moment, the price of oil is way below the price cap set and decided. Therefore, it is not that binding to this particular situation. How are the Russians reacting to this? Russia ideally would likely to get on counteracting these actions against them to get their business back up again. But this process isn't something which can be done over a short period of time. One of the most effective ways in which the Russians might react to the current situation would be to circumvent the situations of the ship bans by building their own personal fleet of tankers. This would prove to be quite a difficult task, as there are only so many tankers available in the world. Also, the route from Western Russia to Asia is extremely long stretch and would take a very long time to cover. A shadow fleet of tankers emerged since the sanctions were signposted. With speculation, the ships would be used for Russian trading. There's also been an increase in the number of vessels whose ownership information isn't known, some suggesting that those shadow fleet tankers may have been deployed too. With more bans coming onto oil product exports from Russia, it does seem like Russia is in for a very rough period ahead. So what do you think? Do you think Russia would survive this? What actions would Russia take to counteract these actions against them? What further action should be taken against Russia? Let us know in the comments sections. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and smash the bell button to make sure you stay updated on all geopolitical news.